Good morning to you, members of the media. I want to say a special welcome to Rihanna McKenzie from the Newsday, who is joining us here, and to the other members of the media who are joining us through this platform. Good morning to all citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you very much for joining us for this morning's press conference. As you know, this is a weekly press conference that is hosted by the Office of the Leader of the Opposition, where we raise the issues that are current and need attention. With me this morning is my colleague in the Parliament, the Member of Parliament for Bharat Area San Juan, MP Saddam Hussein, who is the Shadow Minister for National Security. I am Dr. Lakram Bodo, Member of Parliament for Faizabad, and one of the Shadow Ministers of Health. So this morning, as we speak with you this morning, we are in the middle of the latest lockdown, which is a measure that was implemented by the government on Thursday as one of the steps to limit and hopefully interrupt what appears to be increased community spread of the deadly COVID-19 virus. And of course, this is as reflected by the increasing numbers of confirmed cases. Let me at this point, on behalf of the opposition, thank all our healthcare workers, our doctors, our nurses, our nursing aides, the ward attendants, the ward maids, those who work in the labs, those who work in the radiology and imaging departments, the attendants on the wards, the clerical and the administrative staff, all of those healthcare workers who continue to battle and on the front line to treat our COVID-19 patients. I also want to commend all our other frontline workers in the protective services, those in the immigration and other departments, as they continue to support the others in the battle against this pandemic. I am sure that many of you would have seen the devastation and the havoc that COVID-19 is currently wreaking in India. And our prayers go out to our brothers and sisters this morning, to our brothers and sisters in India. And we again want to take this opportunity to thank the government of India for their very generous donation of 40,000 vaccines, some of which have already benefited our citizens. And we want to send our best wishes for a speedy recovery in that country. I also want to urge you, fellow citizens, to remain disciplined and vigilant as we do our bit to protect ourselves, family, friends, and others. So where are we currently with COVID-19 in Trinidad and Tobago? It is now 13 months since the pandemic started in our country, when our first cases were reported, as you will recall, in March of 2020. The latest figures from the Ministry of Health's bulletin show that we've now crossed 11,000 confirmed cases, with the last 24 hours showing 248 cases. You will recall that previous to that, we had crossed the 300 case mark, confirmed case mark, with a high of 328 on Thursday, the very day that the lockdown was announced. The deaths now stand at 171. And again, I would want to express my condolences to the family, friends, and the loved ones of those who have unfortunately succumbed to this pandemic. The hospital admissions have started to climb. They now stand at 201. And the numbers of citizens in quarantine is just over 2,000. The figures, in fact, 236 in state quarantine and 1,884 in self-quarantine at home. So we appear to be in not such a good place as far as the COVID-19 is concerned. And at their press conference yesterday, officials of the Ministry of Health raised some issues which ought to be of concern to all citizens. And some of these issues are highlighted in the media today in terms of the Sunday newspapers. And I want to commend the members of the media for the accurate reporting, because I did look at that press conference and I see that there's been some very accurate reporting and concerns raised as well by the media with regards to what was said by the technical officers at the ministry's press conference. So at close to 3,000 the number of positive cases for the month of April was the highest we have recorded in this pandemic. In fact, it was stated, and if one examines the figures, we would see that this figure was higher than the August-September 2020 surge, which took place just after the last general election in August of 2020. The epidemiological charts that were shown to us revealed that there is widespread community transmission, especially in the counties along the east-west corridor, central and the southwestern region. Indeed, Dr. Avery Hines, who is the senior epidemiologist at the Ministry of Health, actually termed this widespread community transmission. And of course, this is a worrisome development. What is also of interest and concern is the fact that there is an increasing of the positivity rate, meaning that 27 out of every 100 of those tested are coming back positive. And what does this indicate? This indicates that there is a higher level of viral prevalence within the community. And I just want us to be aware from a public health point of view that even though some of the numbers are showing up in different counties, it remains a problem throughout Trinidad and Tobago because we are a small island nation state. So the rolling 7-day average has been around 176 over the past few weeks. And as mentioned earlier, we've had spikes over 300 in the past 3 days. I think it's also important that the figures quoted that 55% of the cases are in the 25 to 49 year age groups. This is important because it means these are the individuals who would be most mobile, traveling around, and capable of contracting and spreading the virus. But the deaths continue to remain in the older age groups, those over 60 with the comorbidities. And I'll come back and speak a little bit more about that. Another issue of concern is the discovery and the confirmation of what is called the Brazilian variant of concern in this COVID-19. It's also called the P1 variant. As of yesterday, we've had 6 additional cases confirmed, which brings the total number to 15 confirmed. Now, I just want to make a point about the number of Brazilian variants. It is important for us to know that not all COVID positive samples are sent to the University of the West Indies for the testing for the Brazilian variant. So these figures are just reflect a small sample which is sent. In fact, the 6 additional cases came from about 300 samples that were sent. So it's important to keep in mind that whilst the number of Brazilian variants confirmed is 15, the numbers may actually be higher within the community, and that is something that we need to be concerned about. As we would be aware, the evidence, especially in Brazil, where the numbers have been very high, show that this Brazilian variant is 2.5 times, 2.5 times more transmissible, and it may actually evade the natural immunity antibodies that are produced by those who already have COVID-19, who have had COVID-19. So in fact, what we've been seeing internationally is that patients who have already contracted COVID-19 and are expected to have some immunity may not have immunity against this variant. And of course, it may also carry a higher mortality. And I believe that the number of deaths for the month of April from COVID-19 have been high, and one wonders whether there could be a link between the variant and the increased number of deaths. But that is something that we will have to wait on for the Ministry of Health official figures. So what is also important is that the AstraZeneca vaccine, and I think this is an important point, that the AstraZeneca vaccine has been shown to be effective against the Brazilian variant and also against the UK variant. So this is a very important practical point that needs to be made, and these have come from the studies in Brazil, because if it is that we are having high numbers of the Brazilian variant, and we are saying that the AstraZeneca vaccine can in fact work and be effective against this, then it highlights and emphasizes a need for us to get as many vaccines in as possible, in as short a time as possible. And I will come back and talk about the issue with the vaccines going forward. This morning, coming out of that press conference yesterday and highlighted on the front page of the Sunday Guardian, is the issue with the hospital bed crisis. And this is the Sunday Guardian here saying that there's a hospital bed crisis. And the Ministry of Health officials appeared to be very worried at the press conference yesterday in terms of whether we run the risk of overwhelming the capacity of the parallel healthcare system that is designed and meant to treat with COVID-19 patients. We were told that 10 out of every 100 COVID positive patients are being admitted into the parallel healthcare system, and the bed occupancy rate has been increasing. The figures quoted were 42% occupancy at what is called the ward level for observation, 25% are in HTU beds, and 21% in ICU beds. We also note that the Arima General Hospital and the Augustus Long Hospital have both been brought back into the system to increase the number of beds. But of course, citizens will be very worried as to whether our bed capacity can cope if this virus really gets out of hand. It's also interesting that we're finding that, out of those 10 patients who are admitted daily, only two are discharged daily and 8 remain in hospital. So in response to a question from a journalist yesterday, the Ministry of Health officials pointed to the possibility of overwhelming our COVID-19 designated facilities in as short a time as 3 to 4 weeks if the present trend continues. So I want to make it clear, members of the media, citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, that this is not me, Dr. Bodo, saying this. This is not the opposition saying this. This is a concern raised by the technical officer responsible for institutions at the Ministry of Health, that in fact if the situation worsens, that in about 3 to 4 weeks, we could be out of hospital space. We can sit here this morning and we can argue, as to why we have reached this position in Trinidad and Tobago. Many citizens, have their own positions. We can argue, especially the numbers, especially as our official ports of entry have been stringently regulated since the pandemic began. We can argue, is it imported cases or community spread or both? We can argue that the limited testing in the early days did not give us a true picture of the extent of COVID-19 in our country. We can argue that the late rollout of our vaccination program has facilitated some of this increased spread. But, as a responsible opposition, we are not here this morning to argue. Those are basically moot points, and the population would have their opinions and would debate that issue in due course. Our role and our responsibility as an opposition is to ensure that we seek the interests of citizens and that we hold the government to account, and we ask questions and we seek the answers on the government's plans and state of preparedness going forward in view of this impending crisis. So, in view of the further economic burdens and hardship that you are being asked to bear, the government needs to tell us how they intend to treat it with this worrisome second wave that we are experiencing. So on behalf of you, the population, we would want to ask the government and hopefully get some assurance, especially from the health sector point of view. And I trust and hope that we never reach the position as has been reached in other countries. New York in the past, which is now thankfully recovering, and there's a good model with lessons to be learned there as to how one can get back to normalcy and what is happening in other countries. Of course, Israel as well is another country that comes to mind that has successfully dealt with this pandemic. But we just want to raise the issues of whether all spare equipment, especially ventilators, have been serviced and are ready for use, whether additional critical medical supplies and medications will be available for healthcare staff when required, whether consideration is being given to engage additional healthcare workers, and we are very aware that there's a large pool of unemployed healthcare workers, mainly doctors and some nurses, whether they'll be engaged to allow rotation, especially in high-risk and high-intensity areas, to prevent burnout and to replace some of those who may be retiring, whether consideration will be given to extending the contracts of senior retired nurses so that we can retain their expertise. One issue, and I really, I'm thinking carefully about raising this, but I think it's important that we try to preempt and look at situations that could arise. And I speak of the issue of the oxygen supply being insufficient in the crisis in India. And as we speak, this is going on now. So I just want to raise the issue of whether there will be adequate supplies of oxygen in our healthcare facilities in the event of the crisis that the ministry itself has predicted. There's also the issue of something called rapid antigen testing for COVID-19. This is something that was premised by the Minister of Health in response to questions in the Parliament and in the public domain over a number of months. And I'm reliably informed that this is yet to be instituted and implemented in the public health institutions. Why is this important? The rapid antigen test, unlike the PCR test, is a screening test that can give you a result in less than an hour. And this is an important tool for the doctors at the hospital, the healthcare workers at the hospital, especially in terms of patients who have to go into surgery. So with widespread use of rapid antigen testing, it is a way to minimize the inadvertent introduction of COVID-19 into our regular healthcare system. We are fortunate in terms of having a parallel and a regular healthcare system, and therefore it is very important that we do all in our power to protect the introduction inadvertently of COVID-19 patients into our regular healthcare systems. And of course, we also want to keep on the front burner the issue of whether the systems are being tweaked to prevent what we saw last week at the outpatient clinic at the San Fernando Hospital, where you had hundreds of patients crowding the facility, the outpatient facility, and the police had to be called in, putting police officers at risk themselves. So, I'm trusting and hoping that these matters are being sorted out and being dealt with as we speak, because we have to look at all of the avenues in terms of how we break the chain of transmission. I just want to speak a little bit about the issue of the vaccine procurement and the rollout, because in spite of all the issues that we've discussed, and again, I want to commend the population and the people of Trinidad and Tobago who have been very patient, who have done, the great majority of them have done what they've been asked to do in terms of taking the precautions to interrupt the COVID transmission. But the question really is, has the government kept its part of the deal? The people have kept their part of the deal to a large extent, but has the government kept their part of the deal? At the end of the day, when you look at the countries that have come out of this crisis, it has been due to the fact that they've been able to vaccinate the majority of their citizens in a timely manner. And this is where we are, and this is the elephant in the room that we need to address. And although the figures indicate that we have already vaccinated just over 40,000 citizens, it's a far cry from where we need to be. We need, when we calculate to get herd immunity, we need to have at least 70% of the adult population. So we need to have at least 700 to 750,000 of our citizens vaccinated. When one looks at the figures, even with the arrival of the second batch from the COVAX facility, it means at the end of the day, if we're looking at full vaccination, and I know there are concerns, and again I would want to raise this, there are concerns from those citizens who have received their first vaccine as to whether they are going to receive their second vaccine. And this is an important concern because we know that the first shot gives you about 60% immunity, whereas the second shot, which has to be given within 8 to 12 weeks, can raise your immunity from 60% to about 80 to 82%. So of course, it's a very valid concern for those who have already received their first shot. And therefore, it is even more imperative that the government take all the steps to ensure that going forward, that we not only assure those patients and ensure that they receive their second shot, but what about the remaining citizens? And the longer it takes for us to get the vaccines, the longer the shutdown, the lockdown could be, with the economic and social consequences. So we are calling upon the government, and we're asking the government to explore all avenues to procure the remaining million or so vaccines that are required to create a reasonable measure of herd immunity. I was very disturbed when on the media conference by the Prime Minister in announcing the lockdown, seemed to have announced in a tone of resignation on Thursday afternoon that no vaccines are to be found anywhere. It is certainly an attitude that we cannot afford to entertain. And again, I want to say that we need to review and to look at all of the options and to ensure that we find our space and our place in that line for the vaccines that will become available. And of course, again, we also need to look at whether there's a role for the private sector to be engaged as announced previously by this government. So we are saying that explore all the avenues, ensure that we get the vaccines on board. And again, this is very important with the emergence of the Brazilian variant, the P1 strain, which we know AstraZeneca vaccine is showing to be effective against. So we are saying that the longer this vaccine vacuum remains, the faster it will be filled by variants of concern. And I'm also worried as a medical practitioner of the possibility of local variants developing. And I say this carefully, but we've seen the evidence, and we've seen, for example, in India, where because of the large amount of community spread, that in an attempt to survive, the virus has mutated, undergone variation, and you have the own local strain, now called the double mutant or the Indian strain. And that could very well happen in a country where the numbers continue to rise without vaccination. So there are many, many reasons why the vaccination needs to be rolled out. Most of which is to try and limit the lockdown and the economic and social impact. So the assurance of imminent full vaccination could make the economic discomfort bearable and encourage compliance with public health measures. If people can see in the horizon, in the distance, and they can see that there's an end in sight, then they are more likely to comply, and this is the point that I'm making. So this government needs to pick back up the ball that they have dropped in this vaccine procurement race, and they need to run with it in a focused direction and with purpose. There was never a time in our history when good governance was so essential for our very survival. From day one, we in the opposition, under the astute leader of the opposition, Kamla Prasad Bisesa, volunteered to work with this government in a non-partisan manner to halt this crisis. A team led by Mrs. Bisesa met with the Prime Minister in March of last year, just over a year, and we proffered our suggestions. And we are saying today that we remain willing, able, and ready to assist in whatever way required to take all of us out of this perilous position. Again, my best wishes and prayers go to those who are currently afflicted with this deadly virus for speedy and full recovery. And again, I would want to extend my condolences to the families, friends, and the loved ones of those who have succumbed in this panic. As I close, fellow citizens, I urge you to continue to behave in a responsible manner and follow all the public health regulations, to maintain your physical distancing, to sanitize as and when required, to wear your mask, and to get vaccinated when you're given the opportunity. May we continue to be blessed in Trinidad and Tobago. I thank you. I will now hand you over to my colleague, MP Saddam Hussein.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bodo. Good morning to the members of the media who have joined us in person and also virtually, all the members of public who are logged on, and special good morning and Ramadan Mubarak to the Muslim community. I know we are almost nearing the end of the holy month of Ramadan. We are about 2/3 of finished with the month. So I encourage all of us in order to observe the month and reap whatever benefits that we can in terms of prayer and sacrifices and assistance to those in need, especially in this time of a lockdown again that was recently announced by the Prime Minister. Now, I'm informed, and finally, the new Minister of National Security, Minister Fitzgerald Ethelbert Hines, has now awoken from his deep slumber and has decided to host a press conference this morning, just 2 streets away, to justify his incompetence and gross failure. I just want to tell Minister Imbed this morning that he can run, but he cannot hide. This morning, I will be addressing several issues relating to national security. And the first issue that I would like to address is that burning issue that has been troubling Trinidad and Tobago for some time, especially under this PNM government, which deals with the poor border management. And to put this into context, we must go into a timeline of what really happened and our relationship with Venezuela. Now, in or around 2019, there has been a large influx of Venezuelans to Trinidad and Tobago, as it was the height of the unrest that was taking place there with respect to their political issues and their governance. And we have seen what was taking place in Venezuela, and therefore those persons decided to come to Trinidad and Tobago to see a better life and for protection. And they had the opportunity to do so because our borders remained porous. The illegal migrants from Venezuela continued to come through our borders unaccounted for and not being prevented by this present government. According to the government's admission, as of June 26, 2019, there were 16,523 Venezuelans who were registered through the government's Venezuelan registration system. Now, this is in direct contradiction with other reports coming out from other UN organs and organizations, where other reports have indicated that there are over 40,000 illegal Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago as of 2019. And the Prime Minister hosted a press conference this week, and he sought to blame the opposition and the honorable leader of the opposition, Kamala Persad-Bissessar of Senior Council, for the crisis that we currently face right now regarding the border management. And he sought to ground that blame on the cancellation of the OPV contracts, which was done sometime in 2010. So he is blaming the opposition leader for something that took place roughly 11 years ago. But I want to remind the Honorable Prime Minister and the members of the public who are listening that when those OPV contracts were cancelled, it was not cancelled because it was a change in policy. It was because of serious issues with respect to the vessels and deficiencies and delivery time when it comes to those vessels arriving in Trinidad and Tobago. When that contract was cancelled, the last government didn't sit by idly. The Kamala Persad-Bissessar-led government ensured that when that matter was taken before arbitration, that government recovered $1.4 billion. Let me repeat that. They recovered $1.4 billion for the people of Trinidad and Tobago based on the cancellation of those contracts. So if they had done something wrong, then how it is that they won the arbitration? Then they didn't sit by idly. The People's Partnership Government, by 2015, had acquired 12 state-of-the-art Daemon vessels. 12. So you cancel an OPV contract for 3 offshore patrol vessels, but they instead procured 12 vessels for half of the cost of the OPV contracts. The Kamala Persad-Bissessar government procured 4 coastal patrol vessels, 2 supply utility vessels, and 6 interceptors. And I want to remind the population, at that time in 2014, when now Commissioner of Police Gary Griffith, the then Minister of National Security Gary Griffith, He was the one who indicated to the population that those OPVs were putting square pegs in round holes. So that shows that the Commissioner of Police is clearly, his policy and his alignment is not in line with the government. Those 12 vessels, we left the PNM government with that in 2015. We left that government with that. And what have they done? They have run down those vessels so that they had to park up in stubbles. There was one matter I raised in the parliament where 2 of the vessels, there were fires on both vessels. Then we are hearing that they have no fuel for these vessels. Simple things like fuel, they were unable to give to the Coast Guard for these vessels to go out onto the shore, go out onto the coast to protect our borders from arms, ammunition, and illegal immigrants entering our country. Today we are paying. Today Trinidad and Tobago is paying for the incompetence of this PNM government. The incompetence of Keith Rowley, the incompetence of Stuart Young. And as I said earlier on, they chose the worst of the lot, the failure, a man who has been in public life for several years without a single achievement, Minister Hines, as the new Minister of National Security. It has been 6 years this government has been in power, 6 years. And what have they done? They have procured not a single vessel, not one vessel they have procured for Trinidad and Tobago. Not a single vessel. And then I hear this morning that Minister Hines in a press conference cannot tell us when the 2 new vessels will arrive in Trinidad and Tobago that they ordered from Australia. They can't tell us. They have failed, they have collapsed, and they have caused a national crisis with respect to the borders. That is what they have done. If you have to properly lock down the border, you must have the strategic organs of national security working together. The fight must be in the sea, it must be on the land, it must be in the air, and there must be intelligence to support this. But there has been a collapse of all of that. They have allowed thousands of illegal immigrants from Venezuela to flow through our borders. And I hear that Minister Hines this morning is disputing a video that is circulating on social media with several persons jumping off a pirogue and landing on shore. Well, there is no secret that Venezuelans have been coming to Trinidad and Tobago by pirogue. That's no secret. Even if that video is not in Trinidad and Tobago, it is no secret that Venezuelans are coming here through the south coast via pirogue. That is no secret, Minister Hines. What is happening with the radar? Why isn't it that the radar is not being able to detect all of these persons who are traveling towards our shores? Then, again, I heard Minister Hines this morning say that there are 200 points of illegal entry in Trinidad and Tobago. What have you done? What has the PNM government done in the last 6 years to plug those 200 points of illegal entry? They have done absolutely nothing. And that is why the blame lies solely at the feet of this government for the crisis that we currently face with respect to the illegal immigrants entering our borders. And I will get to the fact with respect to how that is related to what we currently face now with our COVID-19 infections. So you have 200 illegal ports of entry in Trinidad and Tobago, and you leave them open. But there are 2 airports in Trinidad and Tobago, and you lock out our nationals. You lock them out. Lock out our nationals, but allow illegal immigrants to continue to flow through our borders right here in Trinidad and Tobago. Then, Trinidad and Tobago is saddled with the lockdown of businesses, the lockdown of the economy, the lockdown of citizens in their home, but the borders, the illegal borders are left open, wide open. Businesses are suffering. Persons in this country are suffering due to your incompetence. Imagine, it hurts that the borders have been closed since March 2020. Over 13 months now, the borders have been closed. Our nationals, when they have to come back to Trinidad and Tobago, they have to get a negative PCR test. They have to quarantine at expensive hotels, spending thousands of dollars, then quarantine for additional days at your home. Whereas we have persons coming through illegal ports of entry without PCR tests, without quarantine. And then we heard the revealing and frightening revelation in terms of what Minister Dialsing would have said this week, that the first confirmed P1 variant case in Trinidad and Tobago was from a Venezuelan immigrant. How did they come into Trinidad and Tobago? How? The borders have been closed since March last year. The virus, that variant, stems from South America. Then how did it come here? How did it come here? It must have entered through some illegal port of entry, because I think Dr. Bodo could support that it will be a low risk for persons who return through the legal means of entry because of all of the stringent examinations and requirements they have to meet, that there will be a low risk of any infection at all. But when they come through the illegal borders without any test, without any quarantine, that is how the virus has reached to our shores. If our borders have been closed for 13 months, how it is the P1 variant has gotten into Trinidad and Tobago? How? And then you have 15 cases, not just one, 15 confirmed P1 cases in Trinidad and Tobago. It is a total collapse. This government is putting the lives of our citizens at risk, putting the businesses at risk, putting our economy on collapse because of its incompetence to properly manage the borders of Trinidad and Tobago. Then I want to get to another issue. So we got to the Coast Guard. Now I want to deal with the Air Guard. I am being informed, and I want the Minister of National Security to confirm these matters. In December 2019, there were contracts signed with the NOC for crews for the national security helicopters that were expired. And at that time, the unit was under the SSA. For nearly 2 months last year, Trinidad and Tobago had no helicopter coverage. February, Minister Young put the helicopter assets under the Air Guard, and 15 former members were re-engaged, and some were not, and were continuously employed or contracted on various lengths of short-term contracts till April 20th, 2021. Now, since last Tuesday, they were sent home. Pilots, tactical flight officers, operation officers, and engineering managers. There was a meeting 3 weeks ago with the Deputy Commissioner of Air Guard, Wing Commander Hannes, where 4 tactical flight officers and 2 operation officers and the engineering manager. And they were told that their contracts will not be renewed. As of yesterday, there was communication only on Wednesday about the possible re-engagement, but there was no word of any estimated time to re-engage or contract these very essential officers. So Trinidad and Tobago has been with about 1 week now with no helicopter coverage, no helicopter patrols on the south coast, and no helicopter support for the TTPS of Trinidad and Tobago. As I said before, the fight has to be on land, has to be on sea, and it has to be on the air. This is totally disturbing if this is true, that there has been no helicopter coverage, none whatsoever, of our borders and our land due to this matter that I have just raised. We are now faced with a government that has caused our Coast Guard to not sail and our Air Guard to not fly. Next issue I would like to address is that of the travel exemption. Now, a Freedom of Information application was filed and a response was given by the Ministry of National Security dated the 15th of April 2021. And this Freedom of Information application was filed and several questions were asked. And based on the questions that were asked, one of them were asking the minister to provide the total number of persons who applied to the Ministry of National Security requesting an exemption to enter Trinidad and Tobago during the period 22nd March 2020 to present, which would have been, the day the FOI was filed would have been on the 9th of February 2021. The response being given by the ministry was that there were 21,001 persons who requested exemptions during that period from March 2020 to February 2021. Of those 21,100 applications, they were left with 9,427 persons who applied and have been continuously been locked out and are awaiting exemptions. So you have over 9,400 persons, citizens, that have been locked out of Trinidad and Tobago as of February this year, and they are still awaiting an exemption. We have seen how this government has managed the exemption policy, where your application is being expedited if you are a friend, a family, or a financier of this government. They can get exemptions to leave and return freely, but we continue to exile and suffer and ignore the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. As I said, it has been over 13 months now that you have locked out our nationals. It is totally ridiculous. And you have not been able to properly manage the exemption process. We call on this government to ensure that you bring our citizens back home, but ensure that they undergo the required COVID-19 protocols. They will pose low risk, as they have to undergo testing and quarantine. Lock out your citizens while the P1 variant is traveling through Pirog to Trinidad and Tobago. Then, I listened to the Prime Minister this week again with his meltdown when it comes to how he dealt with the restrictions and addressing members of the media. And this morning I would like to tell the Prime Minister that he should leave the law for the experts, because it was offensively inaccurate for the Prime Minister to indicate that the police can enter your home without warrant and enforce COVID-19 regulations on private property. That is what we call dictatorial, it is called autocracy, and it is called pure madness. It is tantamount to telling the police to come to your home and regulate who you have at your home, which family member is allowed at your home, which friend you are allowed to bring at home. That is totally unconstitutional and illegal. You are the owner of that property. You have purchased that property. You have the deed for that property. The police cannot just enter your property. They must do so with the due process of the law. But this is not saying that citizens should not act responsibly. You must act responsibly, as we are still in a pandemic. There's a rise in the number of infections. So you have to act responsibly, but your rights must also be protected during a pandemic. The Prime Minister continues to make laws by press conference. You can't make laws by press conference. And I walked with a very important document. And the Prime Minister has been sitting in the Parliament for over 2 decades, and I'm sure he has a copy of this. This is called the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. This here protects the rights and the freedoms and the guarantees of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. And this morning I would just like to outline a few of those rights that citizens of this country have. It says that you have a right of the individual to life, liberty, security of the person, and enjoyment of property, and the right not to be deprived thereof except by due process of law. The right of the individual to equality before the law and the protection of the law. The right of the individual to respect for his private and family life. The right of the individual to equality of treatment from any public authority in the exercise of any functions. The Constitution. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago guarantees this. No Prime Minister, no minister, no government can come and tell you that they can disrespect these rights in here. They cannot do that. You are guaranteed this. No Prime Minister can take away these rights from you, because these rights were enshrined in our laws as the supreme law of Trinidad and Tobago. So much so that the Prime Minister had to be slammed for these inaccurate remarks by the Law Association. The Law Association in its release said that the Prime Minister was wrong. And I would quote from part of the Law Association where they said, and I quote, that we remind our members and members of the public that there are no regulations governing conduct on private property in terms of numbers of people who may be there, mask and social distancing. No issue of enforcement of private property therefore arises. These are constitutional experts who form part of the Law Association of Trinidad and Tobago. And no member of the Law Association so far has distanced themselves from this release. The lawyers in this country have ensured that this release, we have supported this release. Now, what the Prime Minister and the Attorney General, who is the guardian of the democracy and the guardian of our Constitution, he has agreed with the Prime Minister. Now, that is totally unconstitutional also for the Attorney General to be supporting this view of the Prime Minister. The Attorney General had to do the responsible thing and outline what the law is properly. Now, I want to remind the population that there was an incident last year with respect to Bayside. And when there was an issue of enforcement of the COVID-19 regulations on private property, it was the same Minister of Health, Minister Diyal Singh, the Attorney General, who came out and said that these regulations do not apply to private property. When the Attorney General was photographed maskless, playing arm wrestling and jumping up and dancing, that was on private property. He should have been charged if by the Prime Minister's admission and the Attorney General's statement that these regulations apply to private property, then we should have charged the Attorney General for breaching COVID-19 regulations. He should have been charged. There was no social distancing. They were wearing no face mask. Then, as soon as the wedding was over in St. Clair, we now hear that COVID-19 regulations are being enforced in private property. What has changed? Nothing has changed since the last year to now in terms of the law. What has changed is the tune of the Prime Minister and the tune of the government. That is the only thing that has been changed. And I want to raise an issue in terms of, by the Prime Minister's utterances that day in the press conference, whether or not that is an indirect instruction to the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service to enforce COVID-19 regulations on private property. Because if that is so, that is in fact breaching the separation of powers that is guaranteed under the Constitution. The Prime Minister or no political head of this country must instruct the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. And I would really like the Prime Minister to tell this country, because he owes the country an explanation, who is the legal advisor who gave him that advice on the COVID-19 regulations. Because if the Prime Minister does not want to tell us, we will use the law in order to prompt and force the Prime Minister to tell this country who were the attorneys at law who gave him this particular advice. I just hope it's not the law firm of Al-Arawi, Haynes, Suhan and Company who advised him. Then the last issue that I would like to raise deals with a judgment. A recent judgment dated the 19th of April 2021, entitled Claim Number CV 2010-1352 between Clico Investment Bank Limited and Louis Andrew Montai, Richard Trotman, Stone Street Capital Limited and First Capital Limited. Now in this judgment, there was judgment against Mr. Montai for his involvement as director in the CIB, the Clico Investment Bank, Stone Street Capital, where there was a $78 million loan that was taken to purchase some shares from the Home Mortgage Bank. And the facts of this case is in fact known to the public. But what is instructive of this judgment is that the court found that Mr. Montai must repay the $78 million in terms of restitution for his breach of a fiduciary duty, based on a $78 million loan application that was made orally. That was made orally. The court found that it was irregular, the loan was irregular, that Mr. Montai failed to declare the full nature and extent of his interests in the various companies. He acted dishonestly in not disclosing the true purpose of the transfers, and he deliberately misled certain members, in particular the CIB board, of the transfer of the loan obligations. And this judgment, it is very instructive, and I must remind persons in this country that Mr. Montai was in fact the former treasurer of the People's National Movement. Also, one interesting name came up in this judgment. I believe it was referred to 5 times. that at the time, there was one, according to the company's documents, the notice of directors dated February 14, 2007, that there was one Faris Al-Rawi of number 1 Tobago Avenue, director, was in fact the director of the Clico Investment Bank Limited. Now you have in this judgment, speaking about the irregularities, the breaches of fiduciary duties, and the non-disclosure of certain interests by Mr. Montai to the CIB, the Clico Investment Bank. And at that time, Mr. Al-Rawi was in fact the director of that bank. That particular loan, the $78 million loan, was in fact being approved by all of the directors at that time, including Mr. Al-Rawi. So I want to just ask a couple questions. Whether or not, based on this current judgment, whether or not there was a breach in terms of the due diligence and the fiduciary duty by the other directors to not properly scrutinize this very large deal of $78 million between all of these parties that are to the court action. And I wonder whether or not the Commissioner of Police may, in fact, be interested in a copy of this judgment to determine whether or not there was any criminal wrongdoing on the part of the parties in this action. Because what is important and what is essential to note is that this also involves public funds in terms of the bailout that the government would have taken with respect to Clico. So those are some issues that we intend to raise in the future, but as of now, I'm asking the media to please note those particular issues with respect to this particular judgment. Members of the media, I think this morning Dr. Bodo has done a very comprehensive and clinical task when it comes to the collapse of the healthcare system. I dealt with several issues relating to border management, both in the Coast Guard, the Air Guard, the legal advice that was proffered to the Prime Minister, the travel exemptions, and this latest Clico Investment Bank judgment. We ask you to join us again next week Sunday for a regular opposition press conference. So I thank you very much for joining us, and stay safe. Members of the media, do you all have any questions? All right. My issues in the first place, they should not have been here in terms of hiding. They should have been properly documented via the proper channels in terms of the legal ports of entry. There was a Venezuelan registration process. Over 16,000 Venezuelans were registered, so the government has an indication of who these persons are and where they may be from. The issue right now is whether or not the government has to take, well, not the issue, there's a statement that the government has to in fact take serious steps to lock down the borders to prevent further immigrants from coming into the country that may in fact contribute towards further infections of COVID-19 infections to our citizens in Trinidad and Tobago.
What steps should be taken at this point in time to prevent something like that?
Yeah, well, I thought it's important to raise it in view of what has happened in other countries where there's been widespread transmission. The problem is that I'm hoping that it's not a high possibility, but I think it was important to raise that, especially if we are going to take a longer time for the vaccinations. So I think that should be a prompt and a hint for the government to again address the issue of procurement of those additional and much needed vaccines going forward.
One thing to mention is the offer by the private sector to intervene in the accessing of vaccines. You mentioned you mentioned the fact that the government should utilize all avenues. Is that one of the avenues that we should look at, and what do you think can be done to prevent fake vaccines coming into?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the regulations and the regulatory process is there in terms of only accepting WHO vaccines, and I want to say that, I'm in agreement with the fact that any vaccines to be given to our citizens should come through the approval process by the WHO. Having said that, I think it's important because if we look at the US, over 100 million of their population has received their first shot, which represents about 30% of their population. And the UK, from my research this morning, indicates that I believe about 30 million of the population has received the first shot, which is over 50% or close to 50% of the UK population. So what that means is that hopefully, and we know as well that many of these developed countries would have ordered excess vaccines more than they would have required. And therefore, hopefully, within the next few months, there will be a flood of these vaccines on the market. And I am just, alerting the government to ensure that whatever arrangements that were previously made, revisited with a view to procuring the vaccines. Because the way I see it, without the vaccines, we're going to have a vacuum, we're going to have a gap, which could extend the lockdown, and this is what I'm worried about. I'm worried about where Trinidad and Tobago will be, let's say, at the end of June, July, if we don't have vaccines to follow up. And of course, the engagement of the private sector, you would remember that I believe the Prime Minister had mentioned previously that that was an option with private sector companies. And therefore, we are asking that the government can perhaps revisit that and to revisit all possible arrangements, pull out all the stops, we are saying.
You mentioned the situation in Kenya right now, that the concern that the virus will become this out of control. Do you have those concerns for us here now, given the spike that we're experiencing?
Yeah, well, I think based on the statements made at the press conference yesterday, and the officials at the Ministry of Health would be in the best position to know the figures and the risk and so on. And the fact that it was raised means that we are in a situation. I mean, I'm trusting and hoping that that will not be the case in Trinidad and Tobago, but also I'm also saying that there is an extent to how much you can flatten the curve and prevent transmission by the public health measures. And again, I have to tie this back in to the fact that vaccinations need to be offered concurrently. But I'm really hoping that, that situation doesn't occur. And again, I'd want to ask citizens to do what they can, as far as following the public health regulations are concerned.
I've just been informed that based on some questions I've asked in the Ministry of National Security press conference, in fact, the Chief of Defense Staff indicated that 62% of the assets alone are currently working in Trinidad and Tobago. And the Commissioner of Police, in response to a question, has indicated that there are over 120,000 illegal migrants in Trinidad and Tobago. And this figure is based 4 to 5 years ago. And it may, in fact, vary because of the time that has passed. Now, what that shows is that there has been an admission this morning that we now have a Ministry of Insecurity. That press conference is really to outline the failure and the collapse of what is taking place with our national security apparatus and systems in Trinidad and Tobago. You have over 6 years, Venezuelans, over 120,000 Venezuelans enter this country via pirogue, and you can't detect who are these persons who are running this taxi service, this water taxi service between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela. To, in fact, shut this out. This shows a total collapse and failure and crisis that we currently face with respect to our borders and national security. So the Prime Minister has now, and we have now learned that we now have not a Minister of National Security, but rather a Minister of National Insecurity. That is all the questions? Okay. All right. Thank you very much for joining us, and do have a good day and stay safe, everyone.
Following protocols, thank you very much.